Richmond, Virginia, April 14, 1852. In the parlor of the Ashford estate on Grace Street, a wedding gown hangs in the afternoon light. Ivory silk, French lace, seed pearls arranged in patterns that catch the sun. To anyone who enters the room, it appears to be nothing more than what it claims to be, a garment of extraordinary beauty, created for the marriage of Catherine Ashford to Senator William Hartley's son. But there are things stitched into that gown that no one in the Ashford family will ever see. Things meant for other eyes, messages encoded in thread and pattern, in the deliberate placement of every stitch, in the careful construction of seams that will never come undone. The woman who made this gown is named Patience. She is 28 years old. She has been the property of the Ashford family since birth, and in 6 weeks she will be sold. This is the story of what she did with her last commission, a story that was suppressed, hidden, erased from the family records after the war. A story that survived only because one person remembered and because the gown itself still exists, tucked away in a collection at a historical society in Philadelphia, where no one has looked closely enough to understand what they are seeing, until now. To understand what Patience did, you must first understand what she was. In the hierarchy of enslaved labor in Richmond, seamstresses occupied a particular position. They were skilled workers, valuable. Their hands created the garments that projected wealth and status for the families who owned them. A talented seamstress could add significant monetary value to a household's assets. She could be rented out to other families. Her work could generate income beyond the plantation's agricultural yields. Patience had been trained since childhood. Her mother, Ruth, had been the head seamstress at Ashford House before her. Ruth had died when Patience was 14, and the girl had inherited not just her mother's position, but her tools, her pattern books, and her reputation. For 14 years, Patience had sewn for the Ashford family. Morning dresses, evening gowns, traveling suits, undergarments, christening clothes, morning wear. Every significant moment in their lives had passed through her hands, transformed into fabric and thread. She worked in a small room on the 3rd floor of the main house, a converted storage space with a single window facing east. In summer, the heat was unbearable. In winter, she was allowed a small brazier that barely kept her fingers warm enough to hold a needle. But it was her domain, the only space in the entire estate that belonged in some small way to her. The Ashfords believed they knew her. Richard Ashford, the master of the house, thought her quiet and obedient. His wife, Margaret, considered her competent but unremarkable. Their daughter, Catherine, the bride for whom the wedding gown was being made, had never looked at Patience long enough to form any opinion at all. But Patience saw them, every day, every hour. She saw how they spoke to one another when they thought no one was listening. She saw the contempt in Margaret Ashford's eyes when she inspected a finished garment, searching for flaws that would justify withheld meals or extra hours of work. She saw Richard Ashford's hands, how they moved when he walked past enslaved women in the hallways, what he believed he had the right to take. She saw Catherine, 22 years old, preparing for a marriage that would elevate the family's social standing even further. She saw the girl's indifference to the labor that surrounded her, the way she accepted luxury as a natural condition of her existence, never questioning the foundation upon which it was built. She saw all of this, and she remembered. The decision to sell her came in February. Richard Ashford had made what he called an unfortunate investment in a shipping venture that had failed. The financial loss was significant enough to require liquidation of certain assets, not the land, not the house, not the field workers who generated the plantation's primary income. But luxury could be sacrificed, skilled labor could be converted to cash. Patience was worth $2,000, perhaps more given her reputation. Richard Ashford had already been contacted by a textile merchant in Charleston who was interested in purchasing her for his workshop. The sale would be finalized in June, after Catherine's wedding, after the gown was complete. No one told Patience directly. She learned of it the way enslaved people learned everything of importance, by listening, by standing still in corners, by becoming so invisible that free people forgot to guard their words. She had been carrying linens past the study when she heard Richard Ashford discussing terms with his attorney. She had frozen in the hallway, her arms full of folded sheets, and listened to her own life being negotiated like a contract for tobacco futures. Charleston, a textile workshop, new owners, separation from everyone she knew in Richmond, from the community of enslaved workers who had become her only family after her mother's death. She had returned to her room that night and sat in darkness for 3 hours without moving. By morning, she had made her decision. The commission for Catherine's wedding gown had been placed in January, 2 months before she learned she would be sold. Margaret Ashford had provided specific instructions. The gown was to be ivory silk with a fitted bodice, long sleeves, and a full skirt supported by layers of crinoline. The neckline was to be modest but elegant. The lace was to be imported from France. No expense was to be spared. Catherine would be married in St. Paul's Episcopal Church on Grace Street. The ceremony would be attended by Richmond's most prominent families. The gown needed to reflect not just beauty, but power. It needed to announce that the Ashfords, despite recent financial difficulties, remained among Virginia's elite. Patience had been given 6 months to complete the work. It was an unusually long timeline for a single garment, but Margaret Ashford wanted perfection. Every stitch had to be invisible. Every seam had to be flawless. The gown would be examined by women whose entire social position depended on their ability to detect inferior craftsmanship. In the months before she learned of her impending sale, Patience had approached the work with her usual care. She had drafted patterns, selected fabrics, begun the initial construction of the bodice and sleeves. But after February, everything changed. She continued to work on the gown exactly as before. Her hands moved with the same precision. Her stitches remained small and even. To anyone watching, nothing had changed at all. But Patience had begun to add things, small things, invisible things, messages stitched into the architecture of the garment itself, where they would remain hidden unless someone knew exactly where to look and what they were looking at. She worked slowly, deliberately. She had time, and she had knowledge that the Ashfords would never possess, the understanding that clothing is a language and those who make it can speak in ways their owners will never hear. The first message went into the interior seam of the right sleeve. Patience used a technique her mother had taught her, something Ruth had learned from her mother, passed down through generations of women who had been stolen from the coast of what white people called the Gold Coast, the region that would later be known as Ghana. It was a form of communication through pattern, not writing. Patience could not read or write in English, but a visual language created through the arrangement of stitches, the type of thread used, the number of repetitions in a sequence. In the cultures from which her ancestors had been taken, textiles carried meaning beyond decoration. Patterns told stories, they marked identity, they preserved history. Specific arrangements of color and form could indicate family lineage, social status, spiritual protection, or warnings. Ruth had taught Patience a simplified version of this knowledge. She had taught her that certain patterns meant certain things, that 3 lines followed by 2 meant danger, that a spiral meant journey, that broken symmetry meant disruption of the natural order. And she had taught her how to hide these patterns where they would not be seen. Inside the right sleeve, using silk thread that matched the interior fabric exactly, Patience stitched a pattern that meant captivity, repeated 17 times, once for every year she had lived since her mother's death. The stitches were so small that they would be invisible to casual inspection. They followed the seam line precisely, appearing to be nothing more than structural reinforcement. But to anyone who understood the language, to anyone who had been taught to look, the meaning was clear. This garment was made by someone who was not free. The second message went into the hem. The gown's skirt was enormous, as fashion demanded. It required yards and yards of silk, all of which had to be hemmed by hand. Patience spent 3 weeks on the hem alone, working by candlelight after her other daily tasks were complete. Inside the folded edge of the fabric, invisible once the hem was sewn, she began to encode numbers. The system was simple. Each stitch represented a unit. The spacing between stitches represented values. By varying the length and frequency of her stitches in precise ways, she could create numerical sequences that to anyone examining the hem from the outside would appear to be nothing more than ordinary needlework. She stitched the date she was born, the date her mother died, the date she learned she would be sold, the price that had been set for her body. $2,000, translated into a sequence of stitches that ran along 3 feet of hemline, invisible and permanent. She worked in absolute silence. Even the other enslaved workers in the house did not know what she was doing. This was not collaboration. This was not a rebellion that required numbers or organization. This was something else, a private act of witness, a refusal to let her existence pass without record. By March, the bodice was nearly complete. The construction of a wedding gown bodice in 1852 was an architectural achievement. It required boning to create structure. It required precise fitting to the bride's measurements. It required the integration of sleeves, the attachment of lace, the creation of closures that would allow the garment to be put on and taken off. Patience had fitted Catherine 5 times. Each fitting required the girl to stand still while Patience adjusted fabric, marked alterations, pinned and repinned seams. Catherine never looked at her during these sessions. She looked at herself in the mirror, turning slowly, examining her reflection from every angle. She spoke only to criticize. The waist wasn't tight enough, the neckline was too high, the sleeves restricted her movement. Patience made adjustments without comment. She knelt on the floor and pinned fabric. She marked changes with chalk. She maintained the posture of submission that was required of her. But while she worked, she listened. Catherine talked during the fittings, not to Patience, but to her mother, who was always present. She talked about the wedding, about the guest list, about her future home in the Hartley estate outside Petersburg. She talked about the enslaved workers she would inherit as part of her marriage settlement. 12 people. Their names were listed in the marriage contract like livestock. Catherine discussed them the same way she discussed furniture. She wondered whether the cook would be adequate, whether the house girls were well trained, whether any of them would need to be sold and replaced with better workers. Patience listened to all of this while kneeling at Catherine's feet, her mouth full of pins, her hands adjusting the hem of a skirt that cost more than most enslaved people would earn in a lifetime of labor they would never be paid for. And she decided that the bodice needed a message too. The bodice message was the most dangerous. It was also the most visible, which meant it had to be the most carefully disguised. Patience chose the lace overlay, the French lace that Margaret Ashford had ordered at extraordinary expense, delicate and intricate, featuring floral patterns of astonishing complexity. Lace of this quality was applied by hand. Each piece had to be carefully positioned, pinned, and stitched to the underlying silk. The stitches had to be invisible. The lace had to appear to float on the surface of the fabric, unsupported by any visible means. It was painstaking work. It required perfect vision and absolute steadiness of hand. Most seamstresses needed magnification and exceptional light to do it properly. Patience needed neither. She had been doing this work since she was a child. She began applying the lace to the bodice in early April. The pattern was floral, as Margaret Ashford had specified, roses and lilies, symbols of purity and beauty, appropriate for a bride. But as Patience worked, she began to make small changes. She altered the orientation of certain flowers. She created gaps in the pattern where the design called for continuity. She introduced asymmetries that were subtle enough to appear accidental, but deliberate enough to create meaning. To anyone looking at the bodice casually, the lace appeared perfect. The flowers cascaded across the silk in elegant profusion. The workmanship was flawless. But if you looked carefully, if you understood that pattern could be language, you would see that the flowers spelled out words. Not English words. Patience did not know English letters, but words in the visual grammar her mother had taught her. Symbols that meant, I was here, I made this, I am not nothing. It was extraordinarily dangerous. If anyone noticed the alterations, if anyone questioned the pattern, Patience could be punished severely. Mutilation was not uncommon for enslaved workers who destroyed valuable property. She could lose her hands. But she also knew that no one in the Ashford family would look closely enough to notice. They did not see the labor that created their luxury. They saw only the result. And so she continued. In late April, something unexpected happened. A woman came to Ashford House. Her name was Dorothea. She was a free black seamstress from Philadelphia, traveling through Richmond on business. She had been hired by another prominent family to create a trousseau, and she had come to the Ashford estate to consult with Margaret Ashford about lace suppliers. Patience was summoned to the parlor to display examples of her work. She brought 3 completed garments, a day dress, an evening gown, and a partially finished christening gown. They laid them out on the settee and stood silently while Margaret Ashford and Dorothea examined them. Dorothea picked up the evening gown. She turned it inside out, examining the seams. She studied the stitching at the cuffs and neckline. She ran her fingers along the hem. Then she looked at Patience. It was a brief look, perhaps 3 seconds, but in that moment, Patience understood that Dorothea had seen something. Not the messages, those were in the wedding gown, which was not present, but the quality of the work itself, the evidence of training that went beyond mere competence. Dorothea said nothing. She complimented Margaret Ashford on the quality of her household's needlework and returned the gown to the settee. But as she was leaving, she walked past Patience and let her hand brush against her arm. It was brief. It could have been accidental, but it wasn't. That night, Patience found a note tucked into the pocket of her apron. It was written in careful script on a small piece of paper that had been folded many times. Patience could not read it, but she knew what it was. She had seen such notes before, passed between enslaved workers, carried by those who moved between plantations and cities, part of a network of communication that existed beneath the surface of the South's surveillance systems. She took the note to Solomon, an enslaved man who worked in the Ashford stables. Solomon had been taught to read by a previous owner's son before such teaching became illegal. He read the note to her by lamplight in the back of the carriage house. It said, "Your work is seen. Do not despair." That was all. Patience folded the note and burned it in the brazier in her room, but the words remained. By May, the wedding gown was nearly complete. The bodice was finished, its hidden messages encoded in lace and stitch. The skirt was attached, its hem carrying the numerical record of Patience's life. The sleeves were set, their interior seams marked with patterns of captivity. All that remained was the final embellishment, the beadwork. Margaret Ashford had ordered seed pearls, hundreds of them.
They were to be sewn onto the bodice in clusters, creating the illusion of dewdrops on the lace flowers. Beadwork was the most tedious part of garment construction. Each pearl had to be individually attached with multiple stitches to ensure it would not come loose. The placement had to be precise. The tension had to be perfect. Too tight and the fabric would pucker. Too loose and the pearl would hang incorrectly. Patience had estimated it would take 3 weeks to complete the beadwork. She began on May 3rd. Catherine's wedding was scheduled for June 12th. That gave her 40 days, more than enough time. But Patience was not thinking about the timeline. She was thinking about the pattern. The seed pearls arrived in a wooden box lined with velvet. There were exactly 873 of them. Patience counted twice to be certain. Margaret Ashford had specified that they should be arranged in clusters of 7, scattered across the bodice in a way that appeared random but was actually carefully balanced. Patience followed these instructions, but she also did something else. She began to use the placement of the pearl clusters to create a map. Not a geographic map, a social map. A documentation of the Ashford household's structure of ownership. Each cluster represented a person. The position of the cluster indicated their role. Kitchen workers were placed near the waistline, house servants near the neckline, field workers near the hem. The pattern radiated outward from the center of the bodice, creating a visual representation of the plantation's hierarchy of exploitation.
Patience herself was represented by a single pearl placed at the exact center of the bodice, directly over where Catherine's heart would be. The symbolism was deliberate. The woman who wore this gown would carry the record of her family's sins against the very center of her body. She would stand before God and community with that record pressed against her flesh, invisible but present. And if the gown ever survived long enough for someone to examine it properly, to decode the pattern, to understand what the placement of those pearls actually meant, then the Ashford family's crimes would be documented in a form that could not be easily destroyed. Fabric could be torn, paper could be burned, but a garment made with this level of craftsmanship, created for this level of wealth, was likely to be preserved, kept as an heirloom, protected. The evidence would survive. On June 8th, 4 days before the wedding, Margaret Ashford came to inspect the completed gown. She entered Patience's workroom without knocking. She never knocked. The room belonged to her. Everything in it belonged to her, including the woman who worked there. Patience stood and stepped back from the dress form where the gown hung. Margaret Ashford circled it slowly. She examined the lace, the beadwork, the drape of the skirt. She lifted the hem and checked the stitching. She inspected the sleeves, the neckline, the closures at the back. She said nothing for a long time. Patience waited. Her hands were folded in front of her. Her eyes were lowered. She maintained the appearance of submission that had kept her alive for 28 years. Finally, Margaret Ashford spoke. "It will do," she said. That was all. No acknowledgement of the months of labor, no recognition of the skill required to create something of this quality. Just 3 words, "It will do." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "You'll be gone before Catherine returns from her honeymoon," she said. "The buyer from Charleston will collect you on June 20th. Make sure your affairs are in order." She left without waiting for a response. Patience stood alone in the workroom, looking at the gown, the last garment she would ever make for the Ashford family, the last thing her hands would create in this house. She had put everything into it, every skill her mother had taught her, every technique she had learned over 14 years of labor, every message she could encode, every record she could preserve. It would have to be enough. The wedding took place on Saturday, June 12, 1852.
St. Paul's Episcopal Church was filled with Richmond's elite. The ceremony began at 11 in the morning. Catherine Ashford entered on her father's arm, wearing the gown Patience had made. Patience was not there. Enslaved workers did not attend their owners' weddings unless they were required to serve. She spent the day in the workroom, packing her tools and the few possessions she would be allowed to take with her to Charleston. But she heard about it afterward, from the house servants who had been required to attend, from the kitchen workers who had prepared the wedding breakfast, from Solomon who had driven the carriage that carried Catherine to the church. They told her that the gown had been perfect, that Catherine had been the most beautiful bride Richmond had seen in years, that the guests had praised the Ashfords' taste and refinement, that the lace had been particularly admired, the beadwork particularly elegant. No one had noticed the messages. No one had seen the patterns. No one had understood what they were looking at. The messages were not for them. Patience was sold on June 20th, as scheduled. The buyer from Charleston was a man named Thomas Wickham. He owned a textile workshop that produced garments for wealthy families throughout the South. He had purchased Patience sight unseen, based on reputation alone. Richard Ashford accepted payment in the study of Ashford House, $2,000 in banknotes and a promissory note for an additional $500 to be paid upon delivery. Patience was given 10 minutes to say goodbye to the other enslaved workers. Then she was placed in a wagon with 3 other people who had been purchased by Wickham, and the journey to Charleston began. She never saw Richmond again. The story might have ended there. Patience transported to Charleston, the wedding gown packed away in the Ashford family's storage, the messages remaining forever hidden, eventually lost when the fabric deteriorated or the gown was discarded. But history is not always linear, and sometimes things survive. Catherine Ashford Hartley wore her wedding gown only once. Afterward, it was carefully cleaned and packed in a trunk with dried lavender and cedar chips to protect it from moths. The gown was stored in the attic of the Hartley estate outside Petersburg. It remained there for 9 years. In April 1861, Virginia seceded from the Union. The Civil War began. By 1863, Petersburg was under siege. The Hartley estate was commandeered by Confederate forces and used as a field hospital. Catherine and her husband fled to relatives in North Carolina, taking only what they could carry. The wedding gown remained in the attic. In April 1865, when Petersburg fell to Union forces, the Hartley estate was burned. Most of the house was destroyed, but before the fire reached the attic, a Union soldier from the 5th Massachusetts Cavalry, a black regiment, entered the building searching for supplies. His name was Nathaniel Freeman. He had been born free in Boston. He had enlisted in 1863. He was 24 years old. In the attic, he found the trunk containing Catherine's wedding gown. He did not know why he took it, perhaps because it was beautiful, perhaps because it was valuable, perhaps because he understood on some instinctive level that things created by enslaved hands deserved to be preserved rather than burned. He wrapped the gown in canvas and sent it north to his sister in Philadelphia, along with other items he had collected during the war, things he thought might be worth something, things he thought should not be destroyed. His sister, Abigail Freeman, was a seamstress. When she unwrapped the gown, she recognized immediately what it was, not just a wedding dress, a masterwork, the kind of garment that required extraordinary skill. She hung it in her workshop, where it stayed for 2 years. In 1867, Abigail Freeman hired a young woman to work in her shop. Her name was Patience, not the Patience who had made the gown, a different Patience, 22 years old, newly arrived in Philadelphia from Charleston, newly free. She had been enslaved in Thomas Wickham's textile workshop until Sherman's army reached South Carolina in 1865. When the workshop was liberated, she had made her way north, following rumors of work and possibility.
Abigail Freeman hired her based on a sample of needlework she provided. The stitching was exceptional, small, even, precise. Patience, this second Patience, began working in the shop in March 1867. In April, Abigail Freeman asked her to examine an old wedding gown that had come into her possession. She wanted to know if it could be altered and sold. The silk was still good, but the style was outdated. Could it be modernized? Patience took the gown to the workroom. She laid it out on the cutting table and began to examine it. That was when she saw the stitches. She noticed them first in the hem, the irregularity of the spacing, the variation in stitch length that didn't seem random but didn't seem purely functional either. She had been trained in Thomas Wickham's workshop by an older woman named Ruth. Ruth had taught her techniques that went beyond standard European needlework, techniques that Ruth said had been passed down through her family from the old country, from before. Ruth had taught her to look for patterns within patterns, to understand that clothing could carry messages for those who knew how to read them. Patience looked at the hem of the wedding gown, and she understood what she was seeing. Numbers, encoded in stitches. She spent the next 3 days examining every inch of the gown. She worked slowly, carefully, documenting what she found. The patterns in the sleeve seams, the alterations in the lace, the placement of seed pearls. She did not understand all of it. The knowledge had been fractured by the middle passage, by centuries of forced separation, by the deliberate destruction of cultural transmission. But she understood enough. This gown had been made by someone who was not free, someone who had used the only power available to them, the power of their craft, to leave a record. Patience brought her findings to Abigail Freeman. Together they decided the gown should not be altered, it should not be sold, it should be preserved exactly as it was. Abigail Freeman contacted the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. She donated the gown with a letter explaining what her employee had discovered. The letter requested that the garment be studied and protected. The Historical Society accepted the donation. They cataloged the gown and placed it in storage, where it remained for the next 153 years. The first Patience, the woman who made the gown, never knew what happened to it. She worked in Thomas Wickham's workshop in Charleston from 1852 until 1865, 13 years. She produced countless garments, dresses, suits, undergarments, household linens. None of them contained messages. Wickham's workshop was different from the Ashford household. The labor was more closely supervised. The workers were more numerous. Privacy was impossible. But Patience remembered what she had done in Richmond. She remembered the wedding gown. She remembered every stitch she had placed, every pattern she had encoded. When Sherman's army reached Charleston in February 1865 and the workshop was abandoned, Patience walked out the front door and did not look back. She was 41 years old. She had been enslaved for her entire life. She had no money, no property, no family that she could locate. But she had her skill, and she had her memory. She found work with a freedwoman who ran a laundry service. The work was hard, the pay was minimal, but it was hers. She was not owned. She lived in Charleston for 3 more years, saving what little money she could earn. In 1868, she used those savings to travel north to Philadelphia, where she had heard that opportunities for skilled workers were better. She found work as a seamstress in a small shop on South Street. The proprietor was a white woman who asked few questions and paid fair wages. Patience worked there for the rest of her life. She never married, she had no children, she lived in a boarding house with other working women, black and white,
all of them trying to make their way in a world that had suddenly, violently changed. She died in 1891 at the age of 67. Pneumonia, a common death. The obituary in the Philadelphia Tribune identified her only as a seamstress of some local reputation. It did not mention that she had been enslaved. It did not mention Richmond. It did not mention the wedding gown. That knowledge died with her. For more than a century, Catherine Ashford Hartley's wedding gown sat in the archives of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. Researchers occasionally examined it. Historians of costume studied its construction. Students of 19th century fashion noted its quality. It was referenced in several academic papers on antebellum textile production. But no one looked closely enough at the stitches. No one examined the patterns with the understanding that they might be language. No one considered that the enslaved seamstress who made it might have had something to say. The knowledge that Abigail Freeman had tried to preserve, the letter explaining what her employee had discovered, was misfiled in 1923 during an archive reorganization. It was separated from the gown itself and placed in a different collection. Without that context, the gown became simply an artifact, a beautiful object, evidence of craftsmanship, but not communication, not testimony. In 2019, a textile historian named Dr. Jennifer Washington was conducting research on enslaved needleworkers in the antebellum South. She had been examining garments in various museum collections, looking for evidence of the specific techniques used by enslaved seamstresses, trying to reconstruct knowledge that had been deliberately erased. She requested access to several items in the Historical Society of Pennsylvania's collection, including the Ashford Hartley wedding gown. When the gown was brought to her in the research room, she began her standard examination. She photographed the exterior. She documented the construction. She turned the garment inside out to examine the seams. And then she saw the stitches. Dr. Washington had spent 15 years studying African and African American textile traditions. She had researched Adinka symbols from Ghana, kente weaving patterns, quilting codes rumored to have been used on the Underground Railroad. She had studied the ways that enslaved people had preserved cultural knowledge through craft. She recognized immediately that the stitches in the sleeve seam were not random. She spent the next 6 months examining the gown. She used magnification. She created detailed diagrams of every seam, every hem, every placement of lace and beadwork. She consulted with other scholars, experts in African textile traditions, historians of slavery, mathematicians who could analyze the numerical patterns in the hem. Slowly, painstakingly, they decoded what patients had done. The patterns in the sleeves, the numbers in the hem, the alterations in the lace, the placement of seed pearls. It was all there, a complete record, a testimony stitched into the very fabric of the garment. Dr. Washington published her findings in 2021. The paper was titled Hidden Testimony, Evidence of Resistance in an Enslaved Seamstress's Work. The discovery made national news. The wedding gown was put on display at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. Visitors came to see it by the thousands. But the name of the woman who made it remained unknown. The records from Ashford House were destroyed during the war. No documentation of individual enslaved workers had survived. The seamstress who had created this extraordinary act of witness, who had encoded her testimony in a language that took more than 150 years to decode, remained anonymous. Until Dr. Washington found Abigail Freeman's letter.
The letter had been misfiled under F for Freeman rather than with the gown's original documentation. It had sat in a box of miscellaneous 19th century correspondence for 96 years. Dr. Washington found it during a broader archive search in 2022. The letter was brief, written in careful script. It explained that the gown had been donated by Abigail Freeman in 1867. It stated that an employee, a freedwoman formerly enslaved in Charleston who had previously been held in Richmond, had identified unusual stitching patterns that appeared to be deliberate communication. The letter included the employee's name, Patience. It did not include a surname. Enslaved people often did not have surnames or changed them after emancipation, but the name was enough. Combined with the records from Thomas Wickham's textile workshop in Charleston, which had been preserved and were accessible through the South Carolina Historical Society, Dr. Washington was able to trace the seamstress's movement from Richmond to Charleston in 1852. From there, she found the Ashford family's partial estate records, which had survived the war because they had been stored in a Richmond bank vault. Those records included an inventory of enslaved workers from 1850, among them Patience, seamstress, age 26, valued at $1,800. It was not definitive proof, but it was enough. The seamstress who had made the wedding gown, who had stitched her testimony into its seams and hems and patterns, who had created a record that survived the war and the decades and the deliberate erasure of her existence, had a name: Patience. There is no record of what Patience thought about the wedding gown after she made it. There is no diary, no letters, no testimony recorded by anyone who knew her. We do not know if she hoped it would survive, if she imagined that someone, someday, might understand what she had done, if she believed that her messages would ever be read. We do not know if she thought about it during her years in Charleston, during her journey to Philadelphia, during the decades she spent working as a free seamstress, creating garments that carried no hidden messages because they were made by hands that belonged to herself. We do not know if she died thinking her testimony had been lost, or if she died believing that the act of creating it had been enough, regardless of whether anyone ever saw it. What we know is this: she made the gown, she encoded her messages, she documented her existence and the existence of those enslaved alongside her. She did it knowing she would be sold, knowing the Ashfords would never see what she had done, knowing the risk of discovery. She did it anyway. And now, 173 years after Catherine Ashford wore that gown to her wedding, we can see what Patience wanted us to see. We can read what she wrote. We can bear witness to her witness. The wedding gown remains on display at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. It is shown in a climate-controlled case with special lighting to protect the delicate silk and lace. The display includes detailed diagrams showing the location of the hidden messages, translations of the patterns, explanations of the techniques Patience used. Visitors stand before it in silence. Some of them cry. It is not the beauty of the gown that moves them, though it is beautiful. It is not the craftsmanship, though the craftsmanship is extraordinary. It is the knowledge of what it represents. A woman who had no voice created a language. A woman who owned nothing, not even her own body, created a record that proved she existed. A woman who was valued at $2,000 created something that is now priceless, not because of the silk or the pearls or the lace, but because of what she put into it that no one else could see. Evidence of a mind, a will, a refusal to be erased. The gown is beautiful, but what Patience did with it is more than beauty. It is resistance. It is memory. It is testimony. It is proof that even in the darkest systems of oppression, even when every structure of power is designed to erase you, there are ways to speak. There are ways to be remembered. There are ways to survive.